Hello there, dear listener. Welcome to History's Throne. I'm so glad you've chosen to join me on this journey back in time. Wherever you are in the world right now, whether it's morning, evening, or the quiet hours before dawn, I invite you to get comfortable. Let your body rest. Let your mind drift. Let my words paint pictures for you as we return to a different world. If you'd like, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you enjoy slow, immersive storytelling that brings the past to life, I invite you to subscribe so you never miss a journey like this one. But you don't have to do anything right now. Just listen. Just breathe. Let's begin. Forget silver platters and rich banquets for a moment. Forget turkey legs roasted over open fire and goblets overflowing with wine. The real daily experience of food in medieval Europe was nothing like the feasts of film. It was dull, it was repetitive, and at times it was barely food at all. To live in the Middle Ages was to eat because you must, not because you enjoyed it. And for most, flavor was a luxury they had never even imagined. Bread was the anchor of nearly every meal, but don't picture soft loaves with golden crusts. Medieval bread, especially that eaten by peasants, was coarse, sour, and hard, made from barley, rye, or whatever grains survived the winter. It was baked in communal ovens and often burned at the edges. In lean years, it might be mixed with ground-up beans, lentils, or even bark. And when mold crept in, people still ate it, because the alternative was hunger. Vegetables were available but limited. There were no tomatoes, no potatoes, no corn, not yet. These were New World crops, unknown in Europe until centuries later. Instead, people ate cabbage, onions, leeks, and turnips, boiled into stews that blurred the line between nourishment and monotony. Seasonality ruled everything. A summer carrot was precious, a winter root necessary, and without refrigeration, food didn't just lose its taste, it became dangerous. Salt was essential for preservation, but expensive. Meat, when available, was dried or salted until it resembled leather. Fish could be pickled or smoked, but flavor gave way to survival. Spices like cinnamon, pepper, or cloves existed, but only in noble kitchens, brought at great cost along trade routes that stretched across continents. For most of the population, spiced meant maybe a little mustard seed. Maybe. Drinks were safer than water, but that isn't saying much. Ale and weak beer were common, even for children, not for pleasure but because they were less likely to spread disease. Wine was a status symbol, and often watered down. Clean drinking water, rare, especially in crowded towns where rivers doubled as latrines. And milk, if it wasn't spoiled, was reserved mostly for the very young or the very sick. Even noble dining was no guarantee of taste. The rich had more access to ingredients, certainly. They ate swan, boar, pheasant. But preparation often masked freshness with excessive spice or vinegar. And the idea of sweetness or balanced seasoning didn't exist in the way we understand it today. Meals were about display and hierarchy. Roasted peacocks served with feathers reattached, pies that concealed entire animals inside. Not flavor, not nourishment, not comfort. Food, in short, reflected the hardships of the age. It was functional, it was limited, and it was never guaranteed. Famine struck regularly, crops failed, livestock died in the cold. In those times, even the worst bread was a blessing. People prayed for crumbs, boiled weeds, ate rats. In the Middle Ages, food was not pleasure, it was survival. And most days, it didn't even try to be more than that. Bread may have been the lifeblood of medieval diets, but that didn't make it safe. In fact, the very thing that filled the stomachs of peasants and lords alike was often laced with quiet threats. Disease didn't always come from wounds or warfare. Sometimes it rose from the very fields that fed you, disguised in a crust, swallowed without question. Grain was everything. Wheat if you were rich, barley or rye if you weren't. But harvesting grain was a gamble. Rain at the wrong time could ruin the crop. A damp granary could turn stored wheat into a nest for molds. Rats gnawed through sacks. Insects bred invisibly. And once that grain was ground into flour, none of it could be undone. The bread was baked, the loaves shared, the danger already in motion. One of the most feared but poorly understood threats was ergot, a fungal growth that sometimes infected rye. On the outside, it appeared harmless, even unnoticeable. But inside the body, it unleashed chaos. Ergotism, known in later years as St. Anthony's fire, caused convulsions, hallucinations, burning sensations in the limbs, even death. Villages would suffer in waves, first a tingling in the fingers, then madness, then silence. And still, people ate, because they had no choice. Food was rarely thrown away. Spoiled meat might be cooked again, heavily salted or masked with vinegar. Sour ale was simply drunk faster. Bread with mold was toasted near the fire, its worst parts cut away if they could be. For people who lived with hunger as a daily companion, waste was unthinkable. The risk of illness was real, yes, but so was the certainty of starvation. And the punishment for stealing food, no matter how rotten, could be severe. A peasant caught taking bread during a famine might lose more than a hand. Markets were guarded, grain stores locked. Lords enforced grain taxes, even in desperate years. The irony was bitter, that people could die of hunger surrounded by food they were forbidden to touch. Even for those lucky enough to grow their own, the yield could betray them. A few weeks of damp weather, and the grain could sprout mold before harvest. A cold snap, and it wouldn't mature at all. And so people hedged their survival with knowledge passed down in whispers. Which weeds could be boiled, which mushrooms not to trust, how to spot a diseased ear of wheat. Their lives depended on it. Their children's lives depended on it, and even then, it was often not enough. To eat in the Middle Ages was not only a matter of appetite, it was a matter of luck, vigilance, and faith. Every bite was a quiet wager against the invisible world, against rot, infection, hunger, and decay. And so when we look back at medieval food, we should not laugh at how bland it was. We should marvel that anyone ate at all and survived. It's tempting to think the wealthy ate well in the Middle Ages. Compared to peasants chewing on black rye crusts and boiling cabbage for the 100th day in a row, the royal and noble classes certainly had more meat, more spice, more choice. But more does not always mean better. In fact, the diets of the wealthy were often unbalanced, excessive, and deeply misunderstood. In their pursuit of status, they often consumed themselves into sickness. The medieval elite dined with spectacle. Meals were not just nourishment, they were performances. Tables groaned with whole roasted animals, sometimes disguised as others. Peacocks dressed in their own feathers. Pies that spilled live birds when opened. Swans painted with saffron and gold leaf. But the food wasn't necessarily good. It was meant to impress, not satisfy. Flavors competed more than they complemented. Freshness was secondary to flash. Spices were symbols of wealth, and the more used, the better. But they didn't always serve the food. Cinnamon on fish, cloves in beef. Vinegar splashed over everything to mask age. Garlic and onions, common among peasants, were considered too crude for refined palates. Instead, the nobility indulged in dense sauces that blended sweetness with spice, poured generously over meats that had sometimes traveled for days or sat too long in a warm kitchen. Decay was simply hidden under a layer of excess. Vegetables, though common in lower-class diets, were often avoided by the wealthy, believed to be unfit for noble digestion. Leafy greens and legumes were associated with laborers. Raw fruit was viewed with suspicion. Instead, nobles favored meat, lots of it, alongside white bread and refined pastries. This indulgence came at a cost. Gout, known then as the rich man's disease, ravaged royal households. Digestion suffered, teeth rotted, bowels turned sluggish from a lack of fiber. Their meals were extravagant, but their bodies paid dearly. Hygiene in noble kitchens was no better than in peasant ones. just more elaborate. Slaughtering was still done near the preparation area. Cold storage didn't exist, and the sheer volume of dishes prepared meant food was often held too long before serving. Rats scurried under floorboards, dogs wandered freely, servants handled meats and sauces with bare hands, and yet to speak of illness or refuse a dish might be seen as disrespect. Politeness often won out over safety. Then there was the issue of medicine, or what passed for it. Physicians advised nobles based on the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Foods were categorized by their supposed qualities: hot or cold, wet or dry. A physician might prescribe boiled chicken and white wine for melancholy, or forbid fish during certain phases of the moon. These theories shaped entire menus and reinforced food as both status and science, though neither quite aligned with health. So while the poor struggled with hunger and rot, the rich suffered from abundance without understanding. Their banquets were grand, yes, but their nutrition was shallow. Their tables glittered, but their stomachs groaned. And when we imagine them feasting under vaulted ceilings, flanked by gold and song, we might remember they were just as trapped by their food as those who had none at all. In the Middle Ages, famine was not a rare catastrophe. It was a fact of life. It came in waves, sometimes mild, sometimes devastating, always lingering just beyond the horizon. To live then was to carry the quiet knowledge that a single failed harvest could unravel everything. There was no global supply chain, no backup shipments, no relief agencies. When the grain ran out, people starved, and they starved together. The line between abundance and hunger was razor thin. A spring frost at the wrong time, too much rain, not enough sun. A mold that spread quietly through a field, an infestation of locusts. These weren't just agricultural problems, they were existential threats. And when they came, they didn't just affect the poor. Even the moderately wealthy could find themselves trading silver for sacks of barley, watching savings shrink with each dwindling loaf. The land gave and the land took away. Granaries, once full, emptied faster than expected. Bread was stretched with husks and acorns. Soups grew thinner. Meals dropped from 3 a day to 2, then 1, then none. And through it all, the people waited for the next harvest, waited for word from another village, waited for a miracle that might not come. The silence of famine was not just hunger, it was the stillness of hope running out. Those with means hoarded. Lords stored grain behind locked gates. Churches rationed carefully, giving out bread with sermons and warnings. Some turned to theft, others begged at abbey doors, or wandered from town to town, hoping for kindness, fearing rejection. Parents gave food to children and drank water instead. Siblings shared crusts too small to matter. Dogs disappeared. Then cats, then birds. Eventually morality gave way to survival. The Great Famine of 1315-1317 struck with a particular cruelty. It followed years of rain, flooding fields, drowning seeds, rotting harvests before they began. Across northern Europe, people died not in dozens, but in tens of thousands. Bodies lined roadsides, villages emptied. Some resorted to eating bark, roots, even the dead. Chroniclers described scenes they could barely believe, and yet they were true. Because when the earth failed to feed, it took lives without apology. Hunger changed people. It shortened tempers, hardened hearts. People grew smaller, thinner, not only in body, but in spirit. They became suspicious, quiet, less willing to share, more inclined to hoard. Even faith trembled. Some saw famine as punishment, others as a test, but all agreed it was a shadow cast by a world too fragile to understand. To eat became the only goal, to survive the only virtue. And even when the rains passed and the wheat returned, the fear lingered. Hunger leaves a memory in the bones. People remembered how quickly comfort vanished, how neighbors turned cold, how priests grew pale. and they knew it would happen again. Perhaps not next year, but soon. The granary might be full today, the bread might be warm tonight, but the famine would come again. It always did, and when it did, it would find them waiting. To modernize, a medieval kitchen might seem romantic. Glowing hearths, iron pots, hearty meals stirred slowly by firelight. But the truth was far harsher. Kitchens were not warm havens. They were hot, smoky, loud, and profoundly dangerous. The very place where food was meant to sustain life was for many a place of exhaustion, injury, and endless labor. There were no stoves, no ventilation, just open flames in stone hearths, often built low to the ground. Fires had to be kept burning at all times, even during summer heat. Smoke hung thick in the air, stinging eyes and lungs, clinging to hair and clothes. Servants, usually young, poor, and female, bent for hours over cauldrons and spits, sweat pouring, burns inevitable. Many worked barefoot. Burns were common, scars expected. No one called it dangerous. They simply called it life. The tools were crude but heavy. Massive iron pots, wooden paddles, knives as long as forearms. With no time to rest, the day began before sunrise and ended after dark. Bakers woke before all others to prepare bread for the Lord's table. Spit boys, often young children, crouched for hours turning meat skewers by hand, faces flushed from the fire, backs bent before they had finished growing. The meals were not made with love. They were made with discipline, with repetition, with pain. Cleanliness, as we understand it today, was inconsistent at best. There was no running water in most kitchens. Ash floated into food. Dust gathered in storerooms. Meat dripped onto floors, crawling with dogs and rats. Leftovers were often reboiled or baked into pies to disguise their age. Spoiled meat was not always thrown away. It was disguised. Sickness that began in the kitchen didn't stay there. It spread quietly, and still the pot kept boiling. Noble kitchens were enormous, but that didn't mean better conditions. Royal households required dozens, sometimes hundreds of meals per day, multiple courses, specialized dishes. Kitchens were split into stations, boiling, baking, brewing, roasting, all crammed with servants under relentless pressure. Orders barked, accidents ignored. A cut finger wasn't reason to stop, but to bleed discreetly. And if a dish was late, a beating. To serve food was to risk one's body for another's appetite. Then came feast days, spectacles that pushed kitchens to the edge. Animals were slaughtered in staggering numbers. Pies, pastries, and glazed fowl had to be timed to perfection. Fires were stoked constantly. There were no thermometers, no timers. Everything was judged by instinct, experience, or guesswork. One mistake might spoil the roast. One sneeze might cost a position. And no one applauded the cook. The Lord praised the dish, never the hands that made it. Even for small households, the pressure of feeding people without modern tools was immense. Water had to be fetched, wood chopped, fires lit, ingredients gathered, and all of it done daily. There was no cold storage, no preservatives. Aside from salt, everything had to be used quickly, or cleverly disguised if it wasn't. Food wasn't just labor, it was a battle against time, rot, and heat. And in this battle, those who cooked rarely won praise, just blisters, and a little leftover broth, if they were lucky. So the next time we picture the Middle Ages and imagine warm kitchens filled with rustic charm, it's worth remembering what those kitchens actually felt like. The burns, the noise, the smoke, the exhaustion, the quiet pain in the hands of those who made the food, who stirred the pot but never tasted the feast. For them, the kitchen was not a place of warmth. It was a crucible, and every meal was fire-forged out of effort, out of danger, and out of sight. To eat in the Middle Ages was not a simple act of hunger and fulfillment. It was a ceremony, wrapped in invisible ropes of expectation. Who you were, where you sat, What you touched, how you chewed, it all mattered. The medieval meal was not just about food, it was about obedience to class, to ritual, to unspoken laws passed down from table to table, generation to generation. For the elite, the rules began before the first bite. Tables were arranged in strict hierarchies. The most important person sat at the center of the high table, elevated above all others. The closer your seat to the host, the more significant you were. Guests of lesser rank might sit on lower benches or not at the table at all. You didn't choose where you sat. You were placed, and in that placement, your status was announced without a word spoken. Each dish followed its own code. Meat was to be carved in a certain way, by someone trained in the art of serving. Fingers could be used, but only in specific circumstances. Napkins weren't folded on laps, but worn over the shoulder or left on the table. Bread was passed, not snatched. Soup was sipped, not slurped. To reach across the table, to speak with your mouth full, or to refuse a dish, all were breaches of etiquette, noted even if not spoken of aloud. To eat was to perform. Even the food itself was regulated, especially by the church. Certain days, certain times, entire seasons were restricted. Meat was forbidden on Fridays and during Lent. Butter and eggs might be banned as well, depending on the region and the bishop. Fish became the fallback, but not all had access to it. For the poor, fasting meant going hungry. For the rich, it meant clever substitutions, mock meat shaped from almonds, or fish disguised as fowl. The rules were followed, but often bent by those who could afford to. There were also moral expectations tied to food. Eating too much was gluttony. Eating too quickly was impatience. Eating before others was arrogance. Even appearing too enthusiastic about food could be seen as a sign of weak character. Moderation was idealized, but rarely practiced. People dined publicly, but judged privately. A nobleman who licked grease from his fingers might be gossiped about for days. A woman who asked for seconds might be called unladylike, and so meals became a theater of restraint, even when hunger gnawed quietly beneath the table. Bodily functions were tightly policed. Burping, chewing loudly, coughing over food, all were grave faux pas, particularly in formal settings. But without modern medicine or hygiene, such accidents were common. People ate with missing teeth, open sores, parasites, kitchens stank, chamber pots were nearby. Yet appearances had to be maintained. Cleanliness wasn't real, but it was performed. A scented cloth, a sprig of herbs, a carefully arranged dish disguising rot beneath garnish. The illusion of refinement was more important than the truth of it. These rules weren't simply cultural, they were tools of control. They reinforced class, enforced manners, and separated the worthy from the unworthy. A peasant unfamiliar with the etiquette of a noble table might be mocked, dismissed, or punished. And even within households, children were trained in dining conduct before they were taught to write. Because to misstep at the table wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous. It exposed you, marked you, defined you. The food may have been bland, but the judgment was always sharp. To eat meat in the Middle Ages was to partake in a rare privilege. For the vast majority of people, meat was not an everyday food. It was a memory, a feast day indulgence, a smell drifting from a lord's kitchen. It was too costly to raise, too valuable to slaughter, and too sacred to waste. Most peasants lived their lives with more animals than meat, surrounded by the sound of livestock they could never afford to eat. The economics were harsh. Livestock was a form of wealth, not dinner. A pig could be sold, traded, or bred, but killed only in desperation or for celebration. Chickens gave eggs, cows gave milk and labor. To eat one was to give up its future value. And so for ordinary people, meat was a threadbare luxury. When a pig was slaughtered, usually in late autumn, just before winter, it was salted, smoked, and rationed. A ham might last a household months, sliced thinner than paper. Even for those with access to meat, preservation was the first hurdle. There were no ice boxes or refrigerators. Meat spoiled quickly. It had to be dried, salted, pickled, or heavily spiced. The result was rarely tender or flavorful. Salted pork could be chewy, gray, and mouth-dryingly strong. Smoked fish grew tough. Fresh meat, if ever available, had to be eaten quickly and often cooked to oblivion to ensure it was safe. Rarity alone did not make meat delicious. In cities, meat markets were lively, but often dishonest. Butchers padded cuts with fat. Sausages were mixed with mystery scraps. Stale meat was soaked in wine or vinegar, stuffed into pies or served in sauces strong enough to mask the smell. Some sold dog as lamb or cat as rabbit. Rats caught in granaries were cooked in desperation. Meat pies became traps for the unsuspecting, and you rarely knew exactly what you were eating. Religion added another layer of restriction. The church declared dozens of fasting days during which meat was forbidden. For the rich, these rules were sidestepped with culinary creativity, fake meats, sculpted from almonds, or fish, disguised with feathers and color. But for the poor, there were no such luxuries. They obeyed, or they went hungry. Meat, already rare, became morally fraught, something to crave but also fear, to long for and yet feel guilty about. Hunting, in theory, offered a way to supplement the table, but only for the powerful. Forests were reserved for nobility. A peasant caught poaching a deer could lose a hand, an eye, or his life. Even rabbits and birds were protected on royal lands. So peasants trapped quietly at night with snares and silence. They risked everything for a few mouthfuls of protein. And even then, they didn't boast. Meat eaten in secret tasted of danger more than delight. So much of medieval life revolved around food, but not in the way we might imagine. People didn't eat for joy. They ate for fuel. And meat, that most basic source of strength, was too far out of reach for most. It was whispered about, dreamed of, hunted illegally, preserved anxiously, and consumed rarely. And in its absence, other foods had to stretch further. Grain had to fill the belly, fat had to substitute flavor, and hunger had to be ignored, day after day, until the next rare chance to taste something red and rich and real. If it ever came at all, milk, in the medieval imagination, was both medicine and mystery. It was nourishment for infants. Yes, but for adults, it carried uncertainty. It spoiled quickly. It turned sour without warning. It changed with the seasons, with the health of the animal, with the cleanliness of the pail. And though it came from their animals, many medieval people didn't trust milk for long, not in its raw, fresh form. The problem was spoilage. Without refrigeration, raw milk had a short window between life and danger. In summer, it could sour in a matter of hours. In winter, it might freeze before reaching the kitchen, and there were no reliable ways to check its safety. No pasteurization, no testing. A cup of milk might nourish one day and cause sickness the next. So people learned to transform it, to tame it, and that meant cheese. Cheese was one of the few ways to stretch dairy across days or seasons. It preserved protein in a solid form that could be traded, stored, and aged. But cheese, too, was unstable. Some varieties required rennet, drawn from the stomachs of slaughtered animals. Others relied on careful timing and cool aging spaces, which few peasants possessed. The result was a staggering variety of local cheeses, some hard and salted, others soft and pungent, but very little consistency, and even less certainty. Fresh cheese, called green cheese, was especially risky. It was quick to make, rich in flavor, and ideal for spreading, but it was also prone to contamination. Flies, molds, souring milk, unwashed hands, any of these could turn a nourishing food into a cause of illness. People ate it anyway, because when hunger pressed close and bread was dry, a smear of soft cheese was enough to lift a meal, even if your stomach would pay the price by morning. Butter offered another path, but it too had limitations. Churning butter by hand was long, exhausting work, done in homes without clocks or clean surfaces. It depended on time, temperature, and rhythm. One misstep, and the butter would separate badly, or taste of rot. Butter was prized in some regions, forbidden during fasting seasons, and considered uncouth in others. In France and Italy, olive oil was the more refined fat. In Northern Europe, butter was essential, but never elegant. There were other dangers too. Cows and goats were prone to illness. A sick animal might give tainted milk long before it showed symptoms. In some places, people believed milk could carry spirits, bad humors, or curses. Folk remedies involved boiling milk with herbs, or letting a drop fall onto stone to test its quality. There was no science, only tradition. And behind it all, the quiet knowledge that this white, innocent liquid could just as easily heal or harm. And yet dairy remained essential. For children, for the elderly, for the hungry and the sick, it was often the only animal product they might taste in a month. It could be stirred into porridge, softened into curds, hardened into wheels. It filled the gaps between meatless days and stretched the calories of a poor meal. It was a food that required trust in the body, faith in the process, and luck in the cow. So milk and cheese in the Middle Ages were never taken for granted. They were handled carefully, stored cautiously, eaten with a measure of hope. And in that quiet bite of crumbly cheese, or that sip of warm, untrustworthy milk, you can still taste the vulnerability of a time when food came from your own hands and might betray you all the same. In the modern world, we take it for granted that clear, tasteless water flows clean from the tap, ready to drink. In the medieval world, that kind of water did not exist, not in cities, not in villages, not even in most castles. To drink water in the Middle Ages was to take a risk. To cup your hands at a stream or fill a jug at a well was to wonder not just if the water was cold or refreshing, but if it would make you sick or worse. Because in the Middle Ages, the water was worse, much worse. Rivers ran brown through cities, thick with human waste, rotting meat, animal remains, and the runoff of tanneries, dye shops, and butchering stalls. Wells, though safer, were easily contaminated. A dead rat, a cracked stone lining, or a neighboring cesspit could turn a family's water supply into a source of disease. Rainwater was often collected in barrels, but without any filtration, it carried leaves, soot, insects, and whatever the wind blew in. Even snowmelt was suspect. And so people turned to alternatives. Weak ale was the most common, not strong enough to inebriate, but brewed long enough to kill some of the bacteria. It was made from water, grain, and yeast, safe enough to drink daily, even for children. But it wasn't cheap. Brewing took time, fuel, and ingredients. Most households made small batches at home, with varying results. Spoiled ale could cause stomach upset, or worse, and if the grain was bad to begin with, the brew might carry toxins, mold, or rot. Still, they drank because they had to. Wine, for those who could afford it, was the next option. In southern Europe, vineyards were common, and diluted wine was served with meals, used for cooking, and sometimes mixed with herbs as medicine. In the north, wine was an imported luxury, expensive, showy, and often sweetened to mask sourness. Like ale, wine was considered safer than water, but its safety depended entirely on the cleanliness of the barrels, the purity of the grapes, and the honesty of the cellar. And it could go bad, quickly. Vinegar was the more common outcome. Some monasteries developed better systems for filtering and storing water, placing their wells uphill from latrines, lining cisterns with clay, boiling water for brewing. But for most people, these practices were either unknown or unfeasible. Clean water required labor and foresight, two things always in short supply. And even those who tried to boil their water sometimes found the taste off-putting. Water was a last resort, something you washed with, something you avoided drinking, unless you had no other choice. In times of drought or siege, the danger grew worse. Water barrels ran dry, streams slowed to sludge. People dug new wells, desperate and shallow, reaching for dampness in soil that barely held it. Children died of dehydration. The old passed quietly, and the survivors remembered how precious even bad ale had been, how a sip of wine felt like rescue. They learned not to trust water, not ever. And so the people of the Middle Ages lived in a world surrounded by water, but starved for what was safe. They quenched thirst with drink that dulled the edge of danger. They brewed, fermented, diluted, and hoped. And when they sipped, they did not toast. They did not cheer. They drank with caution, with necessity, with quiet, aching thirst, because to drink water was not refreshing. It was terrifying. To the modern imagination, the medieval feast gleams with grandeur. Golden goblets, roasted boar, laughter echoing under vaulted ceilings, tapestries glowing by torchlight. But beneath the spectacle was something far less romantic, a chaotic, uncomfortable, and often deeply unpleasant affair. Feasts weren't designed for comfort. They were stages for power, duty, and show. And for most of those seated at the table, or waiting to be called forward, they were also an exercise in endurance. The first disappointment was the food itself. No warming trays, no heat lamps, no delicate timing. Courses came out in great waves, but slowly and were often cold by the time they reached guests. The finest dishes went first to the high table. Roast meats, sauces, sugared pastries, and only the scraps were passed down. If you sat too far from the center of power, you might receive only bones, gristle, or half-empty platters, and you did not complain. To eat cold meat in silence was better than to speak out and never be invited again. The noise was relentless. Feasts were crowded. Dogs barked underfoot. Minstrels played. Servants shouted over the clatter of trenchers and tankards. Laughter mixed with coughing. Children cried. Armor scraped against stone benches. For hours the feast droned on. And while the lord at the center might smile and sip wine, many guests waited awkwardly, chewing slowly, unsure when to speak or how much to eat. Social terror simmered beneath every bite. You were expected to know the rules: where to sit, how to handle a trencher, when to rise, whom to toast, what to avoid, to spill wine, to burp, to drop a bone on the floor. These could mark you as a rustic, a fool, or worse. Eyes watched constantly, especially if you were new to court. A misplaced fork, or more likely dagger, could cost you a position. A poorly timed joke might linger in reputation for months. And so many ate with clenched stomachs, digesting fear more than food. Conversation was a minefield. Too quiet, and you were dull. Too loud, and you were uncouth. Speak too freely, and you risked offending someone above your station. The wrong compliment to the host's daughter, the wrong opinion about a rival noble, it could all unravel in seconds. Meanwhile, you chewed, swallowed, smiled, and waited for the next course, knowing your status was being judged as much by your words as your table manners. The food was not the performance. You were. And then there were the smells. Open fires, cooked meat, sour wine, unwashed bodies, wet dogs, sweat, perfumes, and rot, all mingled in the air. Ventilation was non-existent. Floors were strewn with rushes and herbs, meant to mask odors, but they only half succeeded. In summer, the heat could be suffocating. In winter, the smoke from a dozen torches curled low across the ceiling, stinging the eyes. And still, the feast went on, for hours, sometimes deep into the night, and no one could leave early without a very good excuse. When it finally ended, guests were expected to praise the meal, the host, the musicians, even if they'd barely eaten or couldn't hear themselves think. Some left hungrier than they arrived. Others staggered out stuffed with food that made them ill the next day. But all of them had performed their roles. They had smiled, bowed, laughed, toasted, and murmured thanks. Because in the medieval world, a feast was never really about food. It was about proving you belonged. To the medieval mind, spices were not seasoning. They were status. To own pepper, cinnamon, or cloves was to hold a piece of distant power, purchased at great cost, carried over land and sea, and guarded like treasure. The modern kitchen might hold a rack of neatly labeled jars, used lightly, casually, without thought. But in the Middle Ages, a pinch of spice was a statement of wealth, and sometimes an act of vanity. Pepper was the most common, and even that was rare. Imported from India through vast trade routes controlled by Arab and Venetian merchants, its price was volatile and always high. Nobles paid by the grain, merchants hoarded it as currency. Some debts were settled in spice rather than coin. In fact, peppercorns were so valuable that they were stored in locked chests and recorded meticulously in household ledgers, not as food, but as financial assets. Other spices, cinnamon, ginger, saffron, galangal, cardamom, and nutmeg, were even more exotic. Most Europeans had no idea where they came from. They arrived in markets already dried, packed, powdered, and deeply mysterious. Their journey had passed through dozens of hands and thousands of miles, and for most, their taste was as foreign as their origin. Spices were used not to enhance food, but to transform it, to make something stale seem noble, or something rotten seem rich. But the heavy use of spice didn't always result in better flavor. Dishes were often overwhelmed. Meat soaked in sauces thick with clove, fish drowned in vinegar and pepper, stews laced with cinnamon and sugar until they resembled a drink more than a meal. What passed for delicacy was often dense, pungent, or syrupy. The goal wasn't balance, it was excess. Spice as spectacle, and to modern palates, many of these combinations would seem jarring, confused, even nauseating. Worse still, many so-called spices weren't what they claimed to be. Fraud was rampant. Ground pepper might be stretched with burnt nutshells. Saffron could be dyed straw. Dried ginger might be old bread, pounded and perfumed, because the profit margins were enormous, and the average buyer, noble or not, had little chance of detecting the difference. Monasteries and courts employed tasters and testers, but trust was always thin. The church added yet another layer of complexity. Spices were sometimes viewed with suspicion, too luxurious, too sensuous. In Lent and other fasting periods, elaborate spiced dishes were frowned upon unless disguised as pious substitutions. Almond milk stews, faked fish pies. Spices were allowed, but only when used in ways that didn't violate the body's supposed moral balance. Because food was not just survival, it was a reflection of your soul. And spice could be seen as temptation. So the presence of spice in medieval cuisine didn't mean the food tasted good. It meant it was rich, political, risky. You added spice not to improve the dish, but to improve your image, to prove you were connected, refined, global in your tastes, even if you had never left your village. And in this world where flavor was often strange, where freshness was fleeting, and where every bite carried weight, a pinch of clove could be as loud as a trumpet, and just as hollow. The medieval year was not measured by clocks, or even days. It was felt in the body, through hunger, through waiting, through the shape of the land itself. There were no supermarkets, no greenhouses, no way to bend time to preserve strawberries in December or cabbage in April. Time passed not just in hours, but in flavors lost and slowly returned. And so hunger became the heartbeat of the calendar. In winter, the world narrowed. The harvest was long past. The stores had been counted. Bins of apples shriveled now. Barrels of pickled cabbage turned soft. Onions braided and hung in cold rooms. And always, the bread drying out, growing sour, cut thinner than before. By mid-January, the meals had shrunk. Butter was hard as stone. Eggs were rare. Meat was a memory, and those who had little left simply learned to wait, to pray, to make do. The days grew darker, in more ways than one. Lent followed soon after, the church's great fast, stretching from Ash Wednesday to Easter. 40 days, not including Sundays, without meat or dairy. For those who could afford substitutions, fish, almond milk, and oil replaced forbidden fats. For those who couldn't, it meant bread, gruel, and little else. The fasting was spiritual, but it also reflected a reality. There simply wasn't much left to eat. Hunger became penance, whether you chose it or not. But as the earth softened and days lengthened, spring returned slowly, first in greens, nettles, wild garlic, dandelion leaves, things plucked from hedgerows and riverbanks, young onions, bitter herbs, the first shoots of sorrel. These were the earliest flavors of rebirth, and they were eaten with both caution and gratitude. Foraging was necessary, but not always safe. Mistaken mushrooms, toxic berries, plants confused by hungry eyes. Spring was hopeful, yes, but still dangerous. By summer, the world filled again. Chickens laid more eggs, milk flowed, fruits ripened, cherries, plums, currants, honey was collected, gardens bloomed. It was a season of color, of wet mouths and full baskets. But the joy was always tempered by work. Crops needed tending. Fires burned hotter. Food was stored with the coming winter in mind. Jammed, dried, salted, cellared, because the memory of hunger was never far. Even in feast, there was fear. Autumn brought the harvest, and with it, a short time of relief. Wheat, barley, beans, apples, root vegetables, pigs were slaughtered, and the meat preserved. Ale was brewed in larger batches. Bread was baked in great communal ovens. For a few weeks, people ate without rationing. They celebrated. They rested. The fields were quiet, but everyone knew this was only a pause. The wheel would turn again, and soon they'd be back in the cold, with cupboards emptying and stomachs tight. In this rhythm of plenty and scarcity, people learned patience. They didn't expect peaches in January or warmth in March. They watched the land. They read the sky, and they made meals from what was near, not what was craved. Time was tasted as much as seen, and hunger was not always pain. Sometimes it was ritual, sometimes reverence, sometimes just the body, knowing the season had changed and would change again. The daily meals of medieval peasants were not glamorous, nor were they deadly, at least not always. They were something quieter, something harder to dramatize, monotonous, repetitive, predictable to the point of invisibility. To be a peasant in medieval Europe was to eat the same few things, in the same ways, at the same times, over and over again. Not out of choice, but because there was simply nothing else. And because sameness, however dull, meant survival. The core of the diet was grain, bread, porridge, pottage, three forms of the same foundation. Most bread was made from rye or barley, coarse and dense, baked in communal ovens if they existed, or else cooked over open hearths. White bread was unheard of outside noble homes. The flour was rough, mixed with bits of chaff, sometimes even grit. Chewing it wore teeth down over time, but it filled the belly, and in a world where hunger waited around every corner, fullness mattered more than flavor. Pottage was the other constant, a thick stew of whatever was available. Cabbage, beans, leeks, onions, and in good seasons, peas or a scrap of salted pork. It simmered all day, sometimes over the same fire used for warmth. Leftovers were added back into the pot the next day, building a flavor that was more habit than pleasure. Every home had its own rhythm of pottage, and while it rarely changed, it kept families alive. Vegetables were humble and limited. Root crops, hardy greens, wild herbs, and whatever could be coaxed from the soil. Carrots, before their modern orange sweetness, were often purple and bitter. Turnips and parsnips were more common. Cabbage grew tough. Everything was boiled, never raw, not because of preference, but because raw vegetables were believed to disturb the stomach or the humors. Warm food was safer, predictable, and easier to digest after a long day's labor. Dairy appeared where animals could be kept. Goat's milk, sheep's milk, and the occasional cow provided sustenance in the form of thin cheese or sour milk. Butter was a rarity, used more often for trade than for taste. Eggs, when they appeared, were carefully rationed. A single egg might be shared among children or hidden in a pottage for protein. But most of the time, dairy was a background note, not a staple melody. Meat was nearly absent. A scrap of bacon boiled into soup, a bit of lard rubbed on bread, a lucky rabbit snared in the field. Chickens were too valuable for their eggs, pigs kept for winter slaughter. Peasants knew how to make do with bones, with broth, with organ meat if it was granted to them. The flavor of roasting meat when it came was remembered for weeks, but most days passed without it, and most bellies learned not to expect more than beans and broth. Dessert was an unknown word. Sweetness came, if at all, from a crab apple or a spoonful of honey, guarded like treasure. Meals ended not with indulgence, but with silence. A scrap of crust, a nod, the cleaning of bowls and the banking of the hearth for tomorrow. And through it all, this quiet truth: they ate to work, they ate to endure, they ate to not die, not to celebrate, not to explore, not to enjoy, just to make it through the day. In modern life, a meal is often a place of warmth, conversation, company, a clinking of glasses, and shared laughter. But for many people in the medieval world, meals were quiet, sparse, and solemn. They were not times for chatter or reflection. They were pauses in the day's work, often taken in silence, often surrounded by others but not truly together. To eat was not a celebration, it was a task. The structure of the medieval day did not lend itself to leisure. For peasants, meals were snatched between labor. A simple breakfast, often just a piece of yesterday's bread and a drink of small ale, was eaten quickly at sunrise. Midday brought the main meal, a bowl of pottage or bread with onions, maybe a bit of cheese. The evening meal, when light allowed, was even simpler. These were not courses. There was no setting of the table. Food was eaten wherever work paused, on a field edge, a wooden bench, the ground. Even in wealthier homes, silence at meals was often expected. Monasteries, in particular, enforced it strictly. Monks dined in complete quiet, heads bowed, hands folded, while one among them read aloud from a religious text. Conversation was forbidden, not out of cruelty, but as part of spiritual discipline. The body was being fed, but the soul too was to be shaped. Even laughter could be frowned upon. Speech was not part of the ritual. Silence was. Among nobles, things were different, but only slightly. Feasts were noisy, yes, but daily meals were structured and formal. A lord might eat with his household, but seating was hierarchical. People spoke only when spoken to. Etiquette governed every movement: how to cut meat, how to wipe one's mouth, how to sip wine without seeming greedy. The wrong word at the wrong moment could shift one's place in the house, and so even in luxury, there was caution. Speech was allowed, but it was never free. For women and children, meals could be even more isolating. In some homes, they ate separately. In others, they ate after the men. The food might be the same, but the power it represented was not. Conversation, if it happened at all, was muted, stories told quietly, instructions given sternly, voices lowered. Meals were not moments to bond, but to observe and learn. A young girl might know her mother's hands better than her voice. A boy might remember his father's silence more than his praise. The act of eating itself could be unkind. Hot food burned fingers. Cold rooms chilled broth before it could be swallowed. Utensils were rare. Knives were personal, carried on one's belt. Hands tore bread, scooped pottage, lifted dripping meat to the mouth. It was a physical act, sometimes messy, sometimes painful. There were no napkins, only sleeves, no plates, only slabs of stale bread or shared wooden trenchers. The table was not a refuge. It was part of the work of living. And yet, in the quiet, something else survived. a kind of unspoken rhythm. The knowledge that even in silence, people were together, that in the steam of a pot, the smell of onions, the warmth of shared food, there was something human, something enduring. They may not have spoken, but they knew one another. They may not have laughed, but they sat close, and in that closeness, in that stillness, there was a kind of comfort all the same. Not joy, perhaps, but endurance, and a fragile kind of peace. To live in the medieval world was to understand that food was not just nourishment, it was also power. It could be withheld, rationed, taxed, and manipulated. It could be used to humiliate, to control, even to execute. Across Europe, from lordly estates to prison cells, food was more than a matter of survival. It was a tool of obedience, and often a weapon. Starvation was the punishment no one named, yet everyone feared. In many places, jailers were not required to feed prisoners unless someone else paid for it. A family member, a friend, a religious charity. If no one paid, the prisoner starved. Slowly, publicly, some begged for scraps through the iron bars. Some shared with rats. Some simply waited to die. There were no rations, no minimums. To be imprisoned without coin was to be sentenced to be hunger itself. Even outside prison, food could become a sentence. In manorial courts and city punishments, wrongdoers might be fined in grain or bread rather than coin. A poor tenant might owe his landlord a portion of his harvest. If he failed to deliver, his plot might be seized, his oven rights revoked, his tools confiscated. Without access to flour or fire, a peasant could not bake, and without bread, a family could not last. A punishment on food wasn't just economic, it was existential. Famine itself was sometimes used to control the population. During sieges, attackers would surround a town not with weapons, but with time. They would wait, watch, cut off trade routes, burn fields, poison wells. No arrows were fired, just silence. And inside the walls, the people began to starve. Bread was stretched with sawdust. Dogs disappeared. Then rats, then leather, and still the gates held, until they didn't, and surrender came on an empty stomach, not a pierced heart. The church, too, understood the weight of food. Excommunication from the church could mean more than just spiritual banishment. It could mean being cut off from food distribution during fasts and famines. In monasteries, monks might be sentenced to eat cold food in silence for weeks, or be forced to sit alone facing the wall. In some orders, those who broke vows were denied wine, meat, or even warm bread. It wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was correction through hunger. Public shame often involved food, or the lack of it. Bakers who sold underweight loaves might be pilloried with their bread hung around their neck. Butchers caught cheating customers could be paraded through the streets with spoiled meat. Some cities made dishonest tavern owners drink their own watered wine or sit beside their own rotten barrels. These punishments were meant to embarrass, to degrade, and to remind everyone that food was sacred and its misuse a moral failing. In this world where meals were precious and irregular, to deny food was more than punishment. It was terror. A blow might bruise, a fine might sting, but hunger clung to the ribs. It whispered in sleep. It hollowed the eyes, and in its silence, it said what no law or priest or lord needed to. You are powerless. You will wait. You will kneel. And only then, perhaps, will you be fed. For many in the medieval world, food didn't come from a garden or hearth. It came from the market. Streets crowded with carts, baskets, shouting vendors, and the hot breath of animals. There was color, noise, and movement. But beneath the life of the market was something darker, a web of deceit, desperation, and risk. Because food sold in the open was rarely fresh, rarely pure, and rarely what it claimed to be. You had to buy with your eyes wide open and your stomach braced. Markets were held weekly in towns and more regularly in cities. They offered fish, meat, bread, produce, cheese, spices, pies, and drink. But these items came without regulation, refrigeration, or much oversight. Fish might be 3 days old, kept in wet cloth and wishful thinking. Poultry might be slaughtered at dawn and left out all day in the sun. Vendors knew the tricks. Wipe the meat down with vinegar, sprinkle herbs to mask the smell, slap a fresher cut on top of a spoiled one. A clean surface hid a rotting core. And then there were the substitutions. Rabbit might actually be cat. Mutton could be old goat. Bread made with spoiled flour was whitened with chalk. Pepper was padded with dust or dried leaves. Honey was stretched with syrup. Butter was made from skimmed milk and thickened with animal fat. What couldn't be afforded was faked. What couldn't be sold was dressed up. For every honest trader, there were two who sold shadows. And the poor had no real choice but to buy what they could afford, even if it made them sick. Wealth did not always buy safety. Even nobles were swindled. Wine was diluted with water or turned sour from poor storage. Imported fruits were old by the time they arrived. Cheeses came wrapped in cloth to conceal mold. Even the king's court occasionally received suspect goods. Inspectors were appointed in larger cities to test the weight of bread and the freshness of fish, but bribes flowed as freely as wine. Justice, like everything else, was seasonal and uncertain, and the dishonest knew just how far they could push. Theft was everywhere. Stolen meat from noble kitchens, grain pinched from monasteries, a quick hand at a fruit stall, a distraction while someone slipped a wedge of cheese into a sleeve. For the poorest, theft was a way to survive. For the desperate, it was the only option. Punishments were brutal, stocks, branding, even mutilation, but hunger was a stronger master than fear. And so the cycle continued. Food was stolen, resold, questioned, consumed, and the hunger never truly went away. Even cooked food offered no guarantee. Pies sold at market stalls might contain scraps of uncertain origin. Liver, lung, offal, mixed with flour and fat. A savory crust disguised the smell. Street broth might be little more than hot water with bones. Vendors moved quickly, changed locations, avoided too much scrutiny. Illness was blamed on bad humors, not bad food. But stomach cramps, vomiting, and fevers followed many a market day. And people still came, because they had to, because it was either that or nothing. In this world, food was not only scarce, it was uncertain. Every purchase was a gamble, every bite a risk. People learned to smell with suspicion, to taste cautiously, to listen for the quiet warning in a seller's eyes. There was no seal of quality, no date of expiry, just instinct, hope, and hunger. And in that uncertainty, in that daily test of trust, the market reminded everyone of the fragile line they walked between being fed and being fooled. In the modern world, eating alone is common, sometimes cherished. A quiet breakfast, a solo lunch, a book by one's plate. But in the medieval world, to eat alone was strange, even suspicious. Meals were communal by nature, shaped not only by necessity, but by belief. In a world where food was scarce, effortful, and sacred, sharing it was a binding force. To eat alone was to step outside the human rhythm of survival. The hearth was the center of family life. Even in the poorest households, meals were taken together, however modest. Bread was torn and passed, bowls shared, spoons dipped in turn. It was practical. Firewood was precious, food preparation laborious, but it was also social. Eating together reinforced the fragile bonds of kinship and duty. Children learned silence and humility at their mother's elbow. Fathers measured the day's labor by what filled their wooden trenchers. There was comfort in the closeness, even if no one spoke. For the rich, the habit of communal eating was even more formalized. Lords dined with their retainers, surrounded by dozens of eyes. To eat alone, even for a noble, was not privacy. It was punishment or illness. The high table symbolized power, and being invited to it, even at its edge, was a mark of status. Seating was arranged meticulously. Every dish sent to the table was a message. You were seen, you belonged, you knew your place, and you accepted your portion without complaint. Meals were public theater, not personal pleasure. Monasteries, too, institutionalized the communal meal. Dozens of monks ate in silence, side by side, their bowls filled from shared pots, their posture watched. A single reader stood at a pulpit, delivering scripture or saints' lives while the others chewed. Meals weren't times for speaking, but for reflection and discipline. To skip a meal was a sign of contrition or illness. To eat alone, even in repentance, was deeply abnormal, something recorded in the monastery's careful ledgers, as though the soul itself needed accounting. Only the sick were exempt. Infirmaries provided food separately. Lighter broths, soft bread, diluted wine. A monk or servant might bring it to the bed. But even then, the absence of company was not a blessing. It marked you. You were away from the table, away from the others. Illness carried a social cost, and recovery, when it came, was often celebrated, not with sweets or comfort food, but with a return to communal bread, to the hard bench and shared pot. Even the condemned were not always alone. In some traditions, those awaiting execution were offered a final meal, but not in private. It was eaten in full view, a ritual of last rites, watched over by priests, guards, or townspeople. Bread and wine, meat, if they were lucky, and often silence. Even this moment of departure was not fully their own. The body was still part of the community until it no longer was. So it was that eating alone came to mean something different in the medieval world. It wasn't a pause for peace. It wasn't chosen. It meant exclusion, illness, punishment, or sometimes death. To eat with others was to affirm one's place in the world, however humble that place might be. And in that closeness, in the quiet clatter of shared spoons, the steam from one pot, the silence of a dozen mouths, there was a reminder that life, however hard, was still a thing shared. To eat in the medieval world was never fully safe. Hunger may have been constant, but even fullness came with risk. There were no modern concepts of sanitation, no health codes or quality inspections. A person could grow the grain, grind the flour, bake the bread, and still fall ill from it, because even food made by hand, eaten under the same roof that raised it, could kill, not quickly, not always violently, but silently, slowly, and often without anyone knowing why. The most feared among these hidden killers was ergot, a toxic fungus that grew on rye and other grains in damp conditions. It looked almost normal at first, just a blackened bit of seed, easily missed during threshing or milling. But once baked into bread or stirred into porridge, it became something else entirely. Ergot poisoning, called St. Anthony's fire, brought hallucinations, convulsions, burning pain in the limbs, fingers turned black, toes withered, people danced uncontrollably, screamed at visions, wandered into the woods, and sometimes they never returned. It was more common during wet seasons, when the harvest had gone wrong, or when food was scarce and nothing could be spared. Entire villages could be affected. Children died quickly. Adults went mad. And because no one knew the cause, no microscope, no germ theory, explanations ranged from witchcraft to divine punishment. Pilgrimages were made to shrines, priests prayed, but the bread was still eaten, because it had to be, even if it burned the body from the inside out. Mold and rot followed wherever food was stored. Bread went stale within days. Cheese turned slimy. Meat, even when smoked or salted, could go bad if not hung properly. Eggs spoiled, ale turned sour, and there were no thermometers, no sealed containers. A person relied on smell, on sight, on experience, and often that wasn't enough. Stomach pain was a common part of life, so were vomiting, diarrhea, and fevers without name. Most illnesses passed unexamined. Foodborne sickness was simply another thread in the great web of suffering. just part of the cost of staying alive. And then there was poisoning, real or suspected. At the highest levels of society, fear of poison haunted every feast. Wine testers, food tasters, special cups of horn or silver, believed to turn dark in the presence of venom. Some nobles refused to eat anything they hadn't watched prepared. Spices were used not just to improve flavor, but to conceal bitterness. Suspicion could fall on anyone, servants, rivals, even family. A stomachache after dinner could be treason. A death by dawn, a quiet message sent without a single blade drawn. But fear of poisoning wasn't limited to kings and queens. Everyday people had their own folk beliefs, that certain herbs could curse, that food left out overnight could absorb spirits, that a jealous neighbor might whisper over your bread and sour it. These weren't irrational fears. They were born from long experience, from generations of watching meals turn dangerous and never being able to explain why. When food betrays you, you learn not just to be careful, but to be afraid. And so people ate with a kind of cautious reverence. They smelled the bread before they tore it. They tasted the stew slowly. They watched for signs in others who grew pale, who fell ill, who failed to rise the next morning. They didn't have the language we do. They didn't know about toxins or bacteria, but they knew enough to fear the meal as much as they needed it. Because in a world without safety nets, without understanding, the food on your plate could be your sustenance or your sentence. Freshness, true freshness, was a fleeting thing in the medieval world, a momentary accident of proximity, timing, and luck. To eat something pulled from the earth that morning, or a fish still slick from the river, was rare. For most people, most of the time, food had already begun to age by the time it touched their lips. It was drying, souring, toughening, and that was not a failure. That was the system, because freshness was not a goal. It was a privilege. Refrigeration did not exist. Ice was a miracle reserved for deep winter, or the rare noble who could store it in underground pits. Most homes, even well-built ones, had no proper pantry, just hooks, sacks, barrels, and the open air. Bread hardened in days, milk soured overnight. Meat, unless consumed immediately, had to be salted, smoked, or stewed beyond recognition. In summer, food turned quickly. In winter, it froze and cracked. The elements had their own say. Time belonged to the season, not the cook. Fresh fruit was a brief miracle. A strawberry in June, a plum in August, a pear in September. For a few weeks each year, the orchard gave, and then it didn't. What could be dried was dried. What could be pressed into cider or preserved in honey was put away. But none of it tasted quite the same. People didn't expect strawberries in October. They didn't long for cherries in January. Their tongues remembered, perhaps, but they did not demand. Freshness came when it came, or not at all. Fish, if you didn't live near the coast or a river, was almost never fresh. Salt cod and pickled herring were the common alternatives. Flaky, dense, soaked to make them edible. These were the fish of fasting, the fish of Lent, and yet people preferred them to fresh fish they couldn't reach. A carp pulled from a pond hours away was already half gone by the time it arrived. Flies, heat, time, they spoiled everything. Fishmongers used vinegar to hide the smell. Buyers used instinct. And meals were made from compromise. Always compromise. Even vegetables lost their freshness quickly. Most households grew what they could. Onions, cabbage, beans, herbs. But preservation was a must. Cabbage was salted. Beans were dried. Onions hung in cool air. Winter brought wrinkled roots, tough skins, flavor dulled by storage. And yet this was the norm. A soft onion was not a disappointment. It was expected. Peasants didn't dream of crisp greens. They boiled, they stewed, they mashed. Freshness was not a standard. It was a rumor from another life. Only nobles flirted with the idea of consistent freshness. Some maintained herb gardens. Others had stewards to source rare items from afar. Fresh quail, spring peas, figs. In royal kitchens, the appearance of freshness was a performance. A salad dressed with violets in March, a dish made of snow in July. But even then, the deception was thin. Most fresh ingredients were hurried in on horseback or disguised with spice and color. It looked new. It was not. Even the powerful could only pretend. And yet, for all that, people survived. They learned to appreciate the dense, the aged, the sour. They leaned into vinegar, salt, smoke, thyme. Freshness was not the measure of quality. Preservation was, skill was, restraint was, and in that way of eating, grounded in season, bound by labor, shaped by necessity, there was still dignity, even if the food was old, even if the joy of ripeness lasted only a week. It was enough, because it had to be. Bread was the foundation of life in medieval Europe, not a side dish, not an afterthought. It was the meal itself for most. Dense loaves of barley or rye, black bread for the poor, white only for the very rich. But behind every loaf was a system most modern people would find strange, because the oven, the very tool of survival, often didn't belong to you. In many manorial villages, the right to bake was not a private one. Communal ovens were controlled by the local lord, and their use came at a cost. This was part of the banalities, a set of feudal obligations that gave landlords control over basic tools, the mill for grinding grain, the press for making wine or oil, and yes, the oven for baking bread. A peasant might grow his own wheat, thresh it, grind it, though often he had to pay to use the lord's mill, but still, when it came time to bake, he had to pay again. The fee might be in coin or in kind. Loaves offered in exchange for oven space, or even a portion of each bake. Refusing to use the lord's oven, or baking in a private hearth, was often illegal. A hidden fire could bring a fine, or worse, some villagers tried to get around it, baking in secret at night or in ashes buried in earth. But these methods were risky. Fire could spread quickly in thatched roof villages. A loaf of bread wasn't just sustenance, it was evidence of disobedience. Even when legal, the communal oven had its burdens. There was the wait, long lines of families with their dough jostling for a place in the schedule. There was the smoke, thick, acrid, clinging to skin and cloth. There was the risk of theft or confusion, whose dough was whose, which loaves had been tampered with. Sometimes someone's bread came out undercooked. Sometimes it was burnt. There were no refunds, no second chances. And still they came, because they had no other choice. The baking itself was laborious. Dough was mixed by hand, kneaded in wide troughs. Yeast was uncertain, borrowed from yesterday's sourdough or coaxed from the air. There were no thermometers, no exact measurements. Everything was learned by feel, by sight, by inheritance. A woman might know her bread was ready, by the way it smelled raw, or how it tugged at her knuckles. But even the most practiced baker could be betrayed by poor flour, bad weather, or a smoking hot oven left too long untended. For those who couldn't afford the fee, or had no access to an oven, flatbreads and ash cakes were common. Baked on hot stones, or in the coals themselves, they were dense, dry, scorched, often made with bran, husks, or ground beans. They filled the stomach, but just barely, and they reminded the eater with every bite of what they lacked, because in the medieval world, even the simplest food required permission. Even bread had a gatekeeper. So the next time you smell warm bread, crust crackling, steam rising, you might think of those who baked it without ownership, of mothers and daughters who waited in line at a lord's oven, handing over their dough and hoping it would rise, of loaves marked with thumbprints or slashes, the only signature they could afford, and of a world where hunger could be eased but never without a price, because even bread, the humblest of foods, was never truly yours. In the medieval world, the church was not just a place of prayer. It was a rhythm, a ruler, a calendar for the body as much as the soul. It told you when to wake, when to rest, when to marry, and crucially when to eat, and when not to. Fasting wasn't a personal discipline. It was public law, not optional, not individual. It shaped the seasons, the meals, the very texture of daily life. Wednesdays and Fridays were days of abstention, along with the full stretch of Lent and dozens of feast eves throughout the year. On these days, meat was forbidden, sometimes dairy and eggs too. The faithful turned to fish, legumes, and humble grains, not as a choice, but as obligation. Even kings bowed to this rhythm. Even nobles, with their tables full of game and venison, obeyed the church's ban. To break it wasn't just gluttony, it was sin. But the difference between rich and poor was never more visible than in how fasting was endured. The wealthy reinvented the rules, creating elaborate dishes that imitated forbidden flavors. Faux roast made from fish and almond paste, eel sculpted to look like pork, creamless custards thickened with bread. They followed the letter but not the spirit. Meanwhile, the poor simply did without. A bowl of beans, a crust of bread, a hollow stomach made holy. Fasting seasons were long and unyielding. Lent alone stretched for 40 days. Advent, Ember Days, vigils before major feasts, all carried dietary restrictions. Over a third of the year could be spent under some form of religious food limitation. These weren't minor substitutions. They were felt in the bones. Children cried for fat. Men labored without protein. Women nursed on little more than broth. And yet none of it was framed as suffering. It was salvation, or so they were told. To fast was to purify. To suffer was to come closer to Christ. Hunger became a kind of liturgy, measured not in prayers, but in bites withheld. The saints had fasted unto death. The monks fasted in silence. The villagers fasted with trembling, not always out of faith, but fear. For to eat meat on a forbidden day was to risk the soul, and to do so openly was to risk punishment by confession, by fine, or by public shame. Exceptions existed, but they were narrow. The sick could be excused, but only with clerical approval. Pregnant women, travelers, children, each group had its own rules, its own gray area. But even then, there was scrutiny. A woman eating butter in Lent might still be whispered about. A farmer caught roasting meat on a fast day could be reported to the parish priest, and so many obeyed not just out of belief, but because their neighbors were always watching. In this world, food was not merely nourishment, it was obedience, it was discipline. The church turned meals into tests of virtue and hunger into a spiritual tool. There was no such thing as eating what you wanted. Your appetite bent to the calendar, to the saints, to the seasons of holy denial. And in that constant negotiation between body and belief, the medieval eater lived in tension between craving and conscience, between fullness and faith. And more often than not, faith won. To picture a kitchen in the medieval world is to misunderstand it. The modern idea of a kitchen, a private, clean, well-lit room designed for cooking, simply didn't exist for most people. Instead, food was prepared wherever it could be, in corners of single-room homes, in outdoor hearths, in shared spaces, in smoke. There were no countertops, no utensils lined in neat drawers, no place to step away from the fire. Cooking was not domestic warmth, it was struggle. For peasants, the hearth was the only heat source for cooking and survival alike. It sat in the center of the room or along one wall, built from stone and clay, burning wood when wood could be spared. The fire had to be tended constantly. Too hot, and the pot burned. Too low, and nothing cooked. There were no dials, no way to control it but instinct. Smoke filled the room, darkened the beams, stung the eyes. Children coughed, infants wheezed, and still, someone stirred the pot. There was little space and less privacy. The same room used for cooking might also be where people slept, sewed, stored tools, or gave birth. Meals were often prepared crouching, bent at awkward angles, hands close to flame. The pot hung on a hook or sat on stones. Most households owned only one. If a second dish was needed, it waited its turn. Bread was mixed on wooden boards, rolled with hands, baked outside if allowed, or not baked at all. Utensils were rare and precious. A single knife might serve every purpose. Spoons were shared. Bowls were wooden, earthenware, or simply hollowed loaves of stale bread. Water came from a well, sometimes distant. Salt was precious. Oil, a luxury. Meat, when it was cooked, was stewed, boiled or buried in embers, not for taste but for preservation. There were no aromas of rosemary and thyme wafting gently through the home. The smell was smoke, sweat, and hunger. In cities and towns, things weren't always better. Space was tighter, fires riskier. Many households relied on communal cooking areas, or bought food already prepared in the market. Street vendors, bakehouses, and taverns served stews and pies. But these were not restaurants, they were compromises. You ate there when your home could not feed you, or when the cost of firewood outweighed the cost of a bowl of pottage. And even then, the food was often cold, reused, or shared by too many hands. For the wealthy, yes, there were kitchens, but even these were far from pleasant. They were separate from the main house to reduce fire risk. Large, drafty, filled with servants and smoke. Fires roared in open hearths. Meat turned on iron spits by hand or by dog-powered treadmills. Kitchens were loud, hot, chaotic. Cooks bore scars, fires flared, accidents were common. Recipes were guarded secrets, measurements done by feel. There were no cookbooks in the modern sense, just oral tradition and hard-won experience. Even luxury had its miseries. So the next time you picture a medieval meal, remember the labor behind it. The hours spent crouched by the flame. The water hauled in buckets. The burns, the cold, the lack of light, of tools, of choice. And remember that to cook was not an art. It was not joy. It was survival. Raw and immediate. It was making something from almost nothing in a space that gave nothing back. And yet, they did it every day because hunger does not wait for comfort. In the medieval world, there was no sharp line between kitchen and infirmary. Food and medicine bled into each other, shaped by the same hands, drawn from the same gardens and cupboards. A soup for supper could just as easily be a cure. A wine infusion might soothe the belly or purge it. But for all the intention, for all the belief, most of it didn't help, and some of it hurt. The guiding system of health was humoral theory, passed down from Galen and Hippocrates. The body, it was said, contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness came when these humors fell out of balance. The task of medicine was to restore equilibrium, and food, more than anything else, was the tool. Every ingredient had a temperature and a moisture assigned to it, hot or cold, wet or dry. Every illness was answered with a carefully chosen opposite. So a fever, being hot and dry, might be treated with cool, moist foods. Lettuce, cucumber, soft cheese. A cold might demand onions or wine. Melancholy, thought to stem from an excess of black bile, was met with warming stews and light meats. But these pairings were not based on nutrition or empirical testing. They were philosophical, symbolic, passed from manuscripts to memory. And in practice, they often did little more than offer comfort. In monasteries and some noble homes, cooks and healers overlapped. Herb gardens flourished behind cloister walls. Infusions were brewed. Honey was mixed with vinegar to ease sore throats. Fennel for digestion, rue for worms, garlic for plague. Some remedies helped, others didn't. But the belief in their power ran deep. Recipes for tonics traveled from abbey to abbey. And for many, healing began not with prayer, but with the contents of a pot. But for the poor, medical food was less a prescription and more a desperate guess. A mother might mash herbs into her child's porridge. A neighbor might offer boiled nettles or warm ale, Most people couldn't name the humors. They only knew what passed down through stories. Ginger warms, mint cools, onions purge, leeks protect. And when someone fell ill, they gave what they could: a broth, a crust, a pinch of something gathered in the woods. It wasn't science. It was survival stitched with hope. And sometimes it went horribly wrong. Toxic herbs mistaken for helpful ones. Moldy bread fed to the weak. Spoiled milk offered to the feverish. Bleeding, purging, vomiting. These were not side effects. They were part of the cure. To be cleansed was to be healed, or at least emptied. And so patients grew weaker. Children wasted away, and still, food was given as balm, because it was all they had, and because to do nothing felt worse. There were moments of quiet success, honey soothed, warm broth strengthened. A well-timed fast eased a poisoned gut, but these were exceptions. The great truth was this: most food as medicine in the medieval world was guided by belief, not outcome. It was a comfort, not a cure, a ritual, not a remedy. And yet, through it all, people kept trying, because illness came for everyone. And when it did, a bowl of broth, however thin, was sometimes all a family could offer, a gesture of love, in a world with no answers. Children in the medieval world did not eat like children do today. There were no special meals, no treats just for the young, no colorful snacks to ease a tantrum. A child was simply a smaller stomach in a household, always stretched thin. They ate what the adults ate, if there was enough to go around. And most of the time, there wasn't. Food was not a reward. It was rationed, quietly, with the cold math of necessity. Infants began life at the breast. If the mother survived the birth and could nurse, wet nurses were employed by the wealthy, sometimes for status, sometimes out of survival. But for most, the mother nursed as long as she could, often well past the age of 2, not just for bonding, but because it spared the child from the dangers of early weaning. Clean water was rare. Cow's milk could sour quickly or carry disease. Gruels and pap made from bread, water, or broth were introduced slowly, cautiously, often reluctantly. As toddlers grew, they joined the family at the table, or more likely, on the floor nearby. They were not served separately. A chunk of bread, a spoonful of pottage, a scrap of soft vegetable. These were not chosen for nutrition, but availability. No one asked what the child liked. They were fed in silence or sternness, watched closely for manners, expected to be grateful. Hunger was a teacher, and fullness a brief and borrowed luxury. There were no children's portions, no sweets in jars, no fruit cups or boiled sweets. A child might go weeks without tasting anything sweet at all, save a berry plucked from a hedge or a crumb of honeyed bread at Easter. And even then, it was rare. Most flavors were bitter, bland, or briny. Salt, vinegar, boiled greens. There were no desserts as we understand them, only the occasional piece of fruit or a bit of spiced wine sipped from a parent's cup when no one was watching. Malnutrition was common, though it had no name. Children were thin, their growth stunted, their teeth wore down early from coarse bread, bellies swelled from parasites. Some cried for food, others grew silent, learned early to eat quickly and ask for nothing. Illness came easily. Rickets, dysentery, fevers. The line between weakness and death was thin, especially in winter, and yet childhood hunger was so universal that it was rarely remarked upon. It was simply the way things were. In noble households, things could be different, but not always better. Children were still expected to eat with formality, often under supervision. Meals were structured, roles assigned. They might be fed finer food, but they were also under more pressure to show decorum, to mirror rank, to remain quiet. A noble child who refused a dish or misused a spoon might be corrected sharply. There was no indulgence, no allowance for mess. Even luxury had its rules. And so, a medieval child learned to eat as they learned everything else, through imitation, discipline, and silence. There was no childhood cuisine, no whimsical lunches, no bedtime snacks, only what could be spared, only what could be stretched. And though some scraps were passed with love, most were given with the weight of need. In a world where survival came first, the child's plate was not a place of joy. It was a mirror of hardship, small, simple, and never quite full, but always eaten, because there was no other way. Children in the medieval world did not eat like children do today. There were no special meals, no treats just for the young, no colorful snacks to ease a tantrum. A child was simply a smaller stomach in a household, always stretched thin. They ate what the adults ate, if there was enough to go around. And most of the time, there wasn't. Food was not a reward. It was rationed, quietly, with the cold math of necessity. Infants began life at the breast, if the mother survived the birth and could nurse. Wet nurses were employed by the wealthy, sometimes for status, sometimes out of survival. But for most, the mother nursed as long as she could, often well past the age of 2, not just for bonding, but because it spared the child from the dangers of early weaning. Clean water was rare. Cow's milk could sour quickly or carry disease. Gruels and pap made from bread, water, or broth were introduced slowly, cautiously, often reluctantly. As toddlers grew, they joined the family at the table, or more likely, on the floor nearby. They were not served separately. A chunk of bread, a spoonful of pottage, a scrap of soft vegetable. These were not chosen for nutrition, but availability. No one asked what the child liked. They were fed in silence or sternness, watched closely for manners, expected to be grateful. Hunger was a teacher, and fullness, a brief and borrowed luxury. There were no children's portions, no sweets in jars, no fruit cups or boiled sweets. A child might go weeks without tasting anything sweet at all, save a berry plucked from a hedge or a crumb of honeyed bread at Easter. And even then, it was rare. Most flavors were bitter, bland, or briny. Salt, vinegar, boiled greens. There were no desserts as we understand them, only the occasional piece of fruit or a bit of spiced wine sipped from a parent's cup when no one was watching. Malnutrition was common, though it had no name. Children were thin, their growth stunted, their teeth wore down early from coarse bread, bellies swelled from parasites. Some cried for food, others grew silent, learned early to eat quickly and ask for nothing. Illness came easily. Rickets, dysentery, fevers. The line between weakness and death was thin, especially in winter. And yet, childhood hunger was so universal that it was rarely remarked upon. It was simply the way things were. In noble households, things could be different, but not always better. Children were still expected to eat with formality, often under supervision. Meals were structured, roles assigned. They might be fed finer food, but they were also under more pressure to show decorum, to mirror rank, to remain quiet. A noble child who refused a dish or misused a spoon might be corrected sharply. There was no indulgence, no allowance for mess. Even luxury had its rules. And so, a medieval child learned to eat as they learned everything else, through imitation, discipline, and silence. There was no childhood cuisine, no whimsical lunches, no bedtime snacks, only what could be spared, only what could be stretched. And though some scraps were passed with love, most were given with the weight of need. In a world where survival came first, the child's plate was not a place of joy. It was a mirror of hardship, small, simple, and never quite full, but always eaten, because there was no other way. Death was no stranger in the medieval world. It came without warning, without fairness, and often without pause. And yet, even in its shadow, life had to go on. Animals needed tending, fires had to be fed, and the living, despite their grief, still had to eat. But food in the days of mourning was different, hushed, symbolic, shaped by sorrow. Not a comfort, but a ritual, a way to mark the loss and to endure it, In most villages, when a person died, neighbors gathered, not just to pray or weep, but to help with the labor of death. A body needed washing, a grave needed digging, and often someone had to cook. The bereaved were not left alone, but neither were they comforted in words. Instead, they were offered food, simple, warm, familiar. A bowl of pottage, bread torn by hand, a mug of small ale, not a feast, not even a meal, just enough to keep the body standing. This practice had deep roots. It was thought that feeding the mourners helped guide the soul, that sharing a meal kept the dead from lingering. In parts of Europe, there were traditions of funeral biscuits, small dry cakes distributed to those who came to the burial. In some places, a crust of bread was placed in the hands of the dead, or under the pillow, or left uneaten at the table, for the spirit, for memory, for respect. Even when food was scarce, something was set aside for the one who could no longer eat. Wakes often included food, but not indulgence. Stewed beans, boiled greens, perhaps a piece of cold meat if the family could afford it. The dishes were heavy, not in flavor but in meaning. They tasted like quiet, like smoke and boiled roots, like the ache of survival. The meals weren't meant to distract from grief, but to carry it, to hold it, gently in a spoonful of something warm. Children were fed first, elders next, the grieving themselves last, if they ate at all. Among the wealthy, mourning could become a display. Large funeral feasts were held to honor the dead, to assert lineage, to show hospitality. But even these followed codes. No bright sauces, no music at the table. Guests were seated by status, courses served with solemnity. Dishes chosen, not for joy, but for form. Cold capons, black bread, spiced wine, a whole roast set before an empty chair. It was not celebration, it was ceremony, a message written in meat and silence. In monasteries, death was marked with fasting. Entire communities might eat only bread and water for days after a brother passed. Meals were taken in greater silence. Scriptures read more slowly. The absence of flavor became the language of mourning, not because food was sinful, but because grief was holy and appetite could wait. There was a sense that to eat simply, sparingly, was to share in the death, to carry a small part of it forward with each bite. And so, even in grief, food remained. Changed, yes, muted, but never abandoned. It was how the living returned to life, how they passed from keening to quiet, how they signaled to themselves and each other that the worst had come, but not everything was lost. The stew would simmer, the bread would rise, and though the seat was empty, the pot still boiled, because even after death, the world had to be fed. To modern eyes, medieval food seems bleak, flavorless, repetitive, sometimes revolting. But for most people who lived through it, this wasn't deprivation. It was normal. It was life. There were no menus to compare it to. No distant lands flashing dishes on glass screens. No concept of culinary delight beyond what the land could grow, the seasons could spare, and the body could endure. They did not mourn what they could not imagine. The average peasant lived and died within a few dozen miles of their birthplace. The variety of food they tasted over a lifetime could be counted on one hand: bread, beans, cabbage, leeks, onions, and if they were lucky, some eggs or a bit of meat on feast days. Spices were not absent. They were unknown. Sweetness came rarely, and mostly from fruit. A taste of honey could feel like indulgence. There was no craving for chocolate or citrus or coffee, because there was no word for them, no taste to remember. Even among the wealthy, the experience of food was constrained by place and time. A noble might have access to exotic imports, sugar, saffron, cinnamon, but they arrived in small quantities, at great cost, and were often used sparingly or performatively. A lord might dine on swan or boar, but he had never tasted tomatoes or potatoes or corn. Tea did not exist in Europe. nor did rice except in traces brought along spice routes. The globe had not yet been mapped onto the plate. People in the Middle Ages were not without preference. They had likes and dislikes, family recipes, treasured combinations, but their palate was shaped by repetition, not novelty. Children grew into adults knowing what every season brought and what it didn't. They anticipated the salted pork in winter, the first green onions of spring, the soft pears of autumn. These rhythms gave meaning, but they did not give variety. There were no surprises at the table, only reminders that life returned in cycles. When change came, it came slowly. A new flavor might drift in with a pilgrim, or a soldier returned from war. A spice merchant might pass through with a story as potent as his goods, but most would never taste what he sold. Most could only listen and imagine. There was wonder, yes, but rarely envy, because envy requires familiarity, and familiarity with flavor was a luxury reserved for the powerful, the mobile, the literate. The rest lived inside their food, like they lived inside their village, firmly, unknowingly. Today, the past looks pale by comparison, but medieval people did not live in black and white. They had color, joy, pride in their cooking. What we see as limited, they saw as skill. What we call bland, they called nourishing, and what we might dismiss as dull, they experienced with the full attention of people whose lives moved more slowly, whose mouths were not dulled by excess. Their taste was sharp because it had so little to compete with. So no, most medieval people had no idea what they were missing. And that was its own kind of grace. They did not pine for mangoes or chocolate or chili. They lived within a narrow world, but they lived it fully. They ate what was given, what was earned, what was grown, and they were grateful, because in a world ruled by labor and loss, even a crust of bread, warm, honest, and whole, was enough to remind you that you were alive, and that was all anyone could ask. In every century, the distance between rich and poor is drawn not just in coin, but in food. Nowhere was this more visible than in the medieval world. A noble might dine beneath a canopy, surrounded by silver platters and six-course feasts. A peasant might eat a cold crust beside a ditch, his stew thickened with weeds, and between them lay more than status. There lay two entirely different experiences of what it meant to eat. One defined by abundance, the other by absence. The medieval feast was a performance. Meat was the centerpiece. Roasted swan, peacock redressed in its feathers, suckling pig, venison, and layered pies stuffed with spiced game. Dishes were carved at table by trained servants. Stews simmered with imported saffron, cloves, or cinnamon. Sugar, more expensive than gold by weight, was used to sculpt castles, ships, birds. Everything on the table declared wealth, not just through taste but through labor, because behind every dish were dozens of hands, hunting, preparing, seasoning, serving. Eating was not survival, it was display. And yet, just a few miles from these halls, hunger pressed like frost into the ribs of the poor. While nobles tasted almonds and currants, villagers boiled turnips with barley. Their meals lacked fat, sweetness, salt. Bread was dense, black, gritty with bran. On fast days, even that might be withheld. Children fell asleep to the sound of their own stomachs. During lean years, grain was stretched with ground beans, acorns, sawdust, and still, it wasn't enough. Because what little food there was first owed in rent. Manorial dues were paid not in cash, but in kind. Grain, eggs, poultry. The Lord's storehouses filled even when the villagers' pantries emptied. And during famine, those stores were often locked, protected, reserved. A peasant might pass by the manor and smell roast beef while his own child coughed from hunger. The contrast was not hidden, it was obvious. And yet it was rarely questioned aloud, because the social order was not just legal, it was sacred. The Lord ate well, because God willed it so. The church, too, displayed abundance. Monasteries received tithes in grain, wine, livestock. Monks brewed beer, kept fish ponds, ate better during fasts than many villagers did on feast days. Some abbots grew fat while their tenants grew pale. Charity was preached, but it was structured, limited, ritualized. A crust to the beggar, a broth to the sick, but the banquet continued behind stone walls, cloaked in incense and silence. Even holiness did not require hunger. And still, the poor endured. They gathered wild herbs, shared what little they had, baked loaves marked with crosscuts and careful hope. They knew their place at the table, often beneath it. Servants in noble houses watched food they would never taste pass under their noses. Women scraped pots for the last spoon. Men rationed a rabbit over 3 days. And sometimes a festival came, and the roles briefly blurred, a shared roast, a communal ale. But by morning, the old hunger returned, and with it, the distance. So when we ask why food sucked in the medieval world, we must ask, for whom? Because for some, food was art, power, spectacle. And for others, it was a daily uncertainty, fought for, prayed for, never quite enough. The table was never level, and the crumbs that fell from it were not kindness. They were a mirror, reflecting a world where fullness was rare, and hunger was not just a condition of the body, but a sentence passed down through birth. To step into a medieval kitchen, if you were permitted, was not to find warmth and welcome, but to enter a world of fire, labor, and scent. Not the fragrant spice of modern nostalgia, but the deep, heavy smell of work, smoke thick in the beams, the iron tang of blood, the must of wet stone and sweat. It clung to the clothes, it filled the lungs. The medieval kitchen was not a retreat, it was a forge where food was shaped by muscle and flame. For most, the kitchen wasn't even a room. It was a corner of the home, open to wind and weather, where a fire burned low and long. There was no chimney, just a hole in the roof or an open door. Smoke gathered in the rafters and rolled into the eyes. And yet, cooking couldn't wait. It had to be done in all weather. Rain blew in, ash soaked to mud, wood smoked instead of burned, but the pot still had to boil. No food came easily. In manor houses and monasteries, where dedicated kitchens did exist, the air was no clearer. Fires roared in great hearths. Multiple spits turned at once, grease dripping into flames, hissing. Carcasses were brought in whole, plucked, skinned, gutted, butchered in place. Buckets of entrails were dragged across stone floors. Blood pooled on boards. Flies clustered. Dogs circled. And through it all, the cooks worked barefoot, barehanded, rarely washed. It was not filth by carelessness. It was necessity. There was no other way. The tools were few and heavy. Iron pots, soot blackened and dented. Hooks for hanging meat. Knives used for everything from onions to offal. No taps, no sinks. Water came by pail, drawn from a distant well. There was no soap but lye, no disinfectant but boiling. Cleaning was effort, not ease. The floor was dirt or rough stone. Bones were swept aside with straw. A meal took hours to prepare and minutes to disappear. There was no time to admire one's work. The smells, too, told their own story. The oily sweetness of rendered fat, the sour tang of fermenting beer, burned onions, boiled cabbage, the ghost of yesterday's fire clinging to every garment. Nothing was neutral. Everything had a scent, even flour, even salt. Nothing smelled clean in the modern sense. And yet people grew used to it. They didn't recoil from it, because to them that was the smell of food itself, the smell of effort, survival, and on good days of enough. And amid the harshness, there were moments of strange peace. The quiet hiss of stew thickening, the soft thump of dough being kneaded, a cook humming, a child nibbling a warm crust. These moments passed quickly, swallowed up by the next task, but they lingered in memory, for even the hardest kitchen bore witness to life, births, Deaths, festivals, fasts, all of it passed through the fire and left behind its scent. So when we speak of medieval food, we must also speak of its setting, of the labor, the grime, the unrelenting heat. The kitchen was not a place of leisure. It was a workshop of survival, a place where hunger met heat and raw things were made bearable. And in that smoke and blood and salt, there was something sacred, not clean, not gentle, but real, because every meal began in the hardest place and ended in the quiet hope that it would be enough. In the medieval world, hospitality was more than kindness. It was obligation, a code, a form of sacred duty passed down not through laws, but through living memory. Whether you were a tenant farmer with little to spare, or an abbot in a stone-walled priory, there were moments when you were expected to open your door and your pantry to a stranger, and sometimes that stranger ate before you did. The roots of this custom ran deep, entwined with Christian teachings, local tradition, and sheer necessity. Roads were long and dangerous. Inns were scarce and often expensive. Pilgrims, messengers, laborers, and even traveling monks moved constantly through the countryside. And when they knocked, the door, if not locked in fear, was supposed to open. A meal, however humble, was to be offered. A place to sit, a crust of bread, a bowl of pottage, a cup of ale, if there was any to spare. This wasn't always done from abundance. More often than not, it was done from discipline, a belief that feeding the unknown traveler might bring divine favor, or at least ward off misfortune. There were tales of saints disguised as beggars, of Christ himself walking cloaked through villages. And there were warnings, too. Deny food to the needy, and your own table might one day go empty. So people gave, not just with charity, but with caution. In monasteries, hospitality was formalized. Benedictine houses, in particular, were bound by their rule to welcome guests as Christ himself. There were designated guest halls, simple beds, and special portions of food, sometimes better than what the monks themselves received. The guest was not questioned at length. He was fed, washed, given bread, wine, and warmth. And only then, if he stayed, would he be gently asked his name. Food came first, questions later. Among peasants, the reality was harder, but the spirit remained. A traveler might receive little more than a slice of black bread or a cup of thin broth, but even that cost something. A family might go slightly hungrier that night. A child's share might be reduced, and still the offer was made, because tomorrow it might be them on the road, them at the mercy of another's fire. The wheel turned slowly, but no one stayed on top forever. There were, of course, exceptions. Fear of thieves, of plague, of hunger itself could harden hearts. In lean years, hospitality frayed. Doors stayed bolted. Dogs were loosed. But even then, those who closed their doors often did so with guilt. Hospitality wasn't just an act, it was an identity. To be known as a household that fed others, even poorly, was a kind of quiet honor. And to be remembered for cruelty at the table, that was a stain that lingered. So in a world where food was already scarce, where every meal was won with labor and fire, the choice to feed a stranger was an act of faith, not in abundance, but in humanity. It was a small resistance against the cold logic of scarcity, a gesture that said, "We are poor, but we are not alone." And in that moment, when a crust was passed or a bowl shared, there was something transcendent, a reminder that hunger was not just a burden, but a bond. If you've stayed with me this far, through the hunger and hardship, the smoke and silence, the empty bowls and the crowded feasts, then you already understand something important. This story was never just about food. It was about people, ordinary, forgotten people, and the way they lived, day after day, within the limits of what the world gave them. Their meals were not recipes, they were endurance. Medieval food matters not because it was delicious, it often wasn't. Not because it was healthy, It often harmed more than it helped, but because it teaches us how survival was woven into ritual, belief, and the slow, patient rhythms of the earth. Every loaf of bread was shaped by someone's hand. Every bowl of stew carried the echo of labor, of season, of scarcity. And in every kitchen, from manor to hut, the same quiet question echoed, will this be enough? It's easy now to forget what it means to earn every bite, to be grateful for blandness, to feel the weight of hunger, not as a metaphor, but as a presence in the belly, the bones. Medieval people, especially the poor, didn't just eat differently. They understood food differently, not as pleasure alone, but as survival, as duty, as sacred. They fasted not just for religion, but because they had to. They feasted not to indulge, but to remember what fullness felt like. Even the rich, surrounded by dishes carved from sugar and meats flown in from distant estates, still depended on a fragile chain of servants, of seasons, of soil. No one, not even a king, could escape the truths of hunger. Grain rotted, storms came, famines swept in without warning, and the body, no matter its rank, could only last so long without the warmth of cooked food and the comfort of something shared. We live now in a world shaped by endless choice, fast abundance, and the luxury of forgetfulness. But behind every bite we take still lies a history of labor, and not so long ago, that labor looked like a barefoot woman stirring a pot over open flame, a child carrying water, a father counting beans, a monk brewing ale, a village gathering for the one hot meal of the week. They cooked without comfort. They ate without variety, but they kept each other alive. So no, medieval food did not suck because it lacked flavor. It struggled because it bore the weight of a brutal world. Because it was never just food, it was faith, it was fear, it was family. And if you listen closely, in the crackle of the fire, in the scrape of a spoon, in the hush before grace, you can still hear them, waiting, working, hoping, holding their lives together with smoke, salt, and bread, and somehow always making it to the next meal. Thank you for listening, dear one. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I hope you're warm and full and resting well. You've earned it.